question of, does a primary melanoma spread first to a lymph node, then to the lung, then to the brain? You'd say to yourself, that's got to be a slam dunk. You've got to know that. We don't. We actually now think that the primary melanoma, back of the hand, that later comes up as a lymph node, that later comes up as a lung metastasis, already seeded the brain when it was a primary. And that it isn't stochastic or sequential or chain of events. It's really a shotgun blast that happened at the beginning that wound up with some of the shot in each of the organs we later see play out. That's a biological question which is fascinating. I mean, 40 years later, it's still fascinating. We don't have the answer to that. That's what we could answer with this kind of event. But no pharma's going to fund that. Well,
the annotation of these samples is absolutely key because as we know with melanoma, a lot of the genetic characteristics that make a person vulnerable can be visualized. The hair color, the eye color, the skin fairness, the amount of freckling, the amount of moles, the kind of moles you make. And so if we can annotate the samples, there's a lot of ways that we can then correlate that with what we see in the tissue. That can help us maybe say, okay, well, these are the markers that add something in addition to those visible things. We don't need to be doing all the genetic testing to tell you whether you've got funny looking moles. Maybe this is in the future. You don't need all that anymore because we know that's what that means now.
It's worth repeating, I think, Sancy said first, this suggestion that melanoma is a particularly genetic disease because not all cancers are. And so that suggests that this might be a higher leverage place to bank than some other tumors. Certainly, for instance, breast cancer, we found that, I mean, that disease is now split into 6 or 7 kinds of cancer, and we're going to continue to split it. And I suspect that it's going to become a cancer that's not even geographical, if you will, anymore. It's either a hormone or non-hormonal cancer. But only some forms of breast cancer are genetic, and the suggestion is that, in fact, this might be a place where, you know, you really have a big opportunity to line up some of those coding issues, if you'll forgive that really layperson term, that are going to suggest who gets treated, why it works.
But the toughest and the most potentially rewarding of all of these arenas, brain metastases, regional metastases, are the primaries, the place where the whole story begins. And Val didn't mention it, but I think part and parcel of what we've thought about this is it's not just the primaries, but even the precursor lesions, the funny moles, the in-between cases that Mo was talking about that are likely or on the verge of becoming melanoma. And these are called melanoma in situ. Now, paradoxically, that's a single cell layer thick. So there isn't much tumor there, but it's often fairly large in breadth on the skin. And so there still is a research opportunity there. And we don't, again, need to get into all of these minutiae, but I think that's a place that we think the research on this disease is the most crucial of all, because melanoma in situ, in spite of the fact that it's called melanoma, is not melanoma. So what do I mean by that? 60,000 cases of melanoma in this country a year. And there are also 60,000 cases of melanoma in situ beyond that. And we learn nothing about those cases. And this is part of what Eisenberg Logie, Dr. Kashani-Sabet, Dr. Leachman, and I are committed to bank tissues on.
But a lot of people don't realize, and including physicians, until they really look into it. You know, when you do a biopsy, I mean, the pathologists, they take one cut through it, and they look at it. And that's all they're really looking at. So really, the rest of the tissue is just sitting there. It's never being analyzed. It's never being used for anything. So to take 1 or 2 additional cuts you know, from an area that the pathologist isn't going to look at, and save it, freeze it, and then, you know, if somebody needs it, well, they can go back, you know, for the actual diagnosis. So they, you know, we are leaving as a community 95% of the tissue. We're leaving all of that on the table. You know, it's never going to be used. It's never going to be analyzed, and yet it could be, if we collected it properly, it could be used for research purposes.
Will there be an unbiased method of evaluating who gets these precious samples?
So the father of tissue bank, Bill Grizzle, who is, if you go to the NCI website and they say if anybody has a question about tissue banking in the world, go to Bill. Bill volunteered his services. So besides sitting here and having coffee on many an occasion, we have had many meetings over the years where we have brought together all the collaborators and Bill and Bill's collaborator and our pathologists at times to go over all of the SOPs. So one of the SOPs is that in order to encourage people to bank, because it is arduous no matter what you do, the initial collaborators have, shall we call it, first shot at the tissue for institutionally approved projects. So those are IRB approved projects. After that, there would be a board made up of certainly each of the collaborators and X unnamed people, and we did start to set the standard. So as I said before, you would have to have a track record in melanoma. You would have to show that you had the funding available. With all of that said, and we would allow, and going back to the pharmacy, we would allow pharmaceutical companies, because if they have a worthwhile project, we certainly want to give them tissue. And even once you were approved, you would be sent a small sample of tissue, and we would want to see what came out of that before we gave over more tissue. So we would be following the SOPs that were designed by literally the father of tissue bank.
I think that, you know, the best way to give you an answer is to give you sort of data that can tell you in our centers how many of these lesions do you see per year in your practice.
Right.
So at Huntsman Cancer Institute, and I know that these guys can give you numbers too for their centers, we see about 500 to 600 new melanomas every year. Because Utah is a referral center. It's sort of in the middle of no place in a way. So we get referrals from Nevada and Wyoming and Idaho and even down in Arizona, and it's very Caucasian. It's very high risk population because you're up at altitude where the light, everybody likes to be outside, so you get a lot of exposure. It's kind of the perfect storm for melanoma. So we have one of the highest incidence rates. So, and they all come to our center. So we do see enough. Now the question is, how many of those are you going to catch? Well, I don't know, but if you've got 500 that you're seeing, if we can catch 50 in a year, I think that's great. If we could do that, that would be orders of magnitude better than what we have right now.